I don't think many people know that before DICE worked on the Battlefield and the Battlefront series, that they were also involved in the Medal of Honor series, as far back as its original inception on the PlayStation 1 in 1999. I've taken a look at most of the games in this series on my channel throughout the years, but the one that I've seemed to always miss is Medal of Honor Airborne. At first I thought that Airborne was like my Macbeth or something, because every time I tried to play through it and do a review, something bad seemed to happen. The first time I played through it, for some reason all of my footage didn't record audio. Next time I tried, I somehow lost both the footage and the script I typed out. Even now, though, replaying through it again, I played a good 2 hours of it, and Shadowplay had decided to record the footage at 1280 by 1024 resolution. But despite all the odds, I somehow managed to get there in the end, and it's one of those games that I've just had people request I take a look at for literally years now. So, here it is.
Care to join us?
Fire in the hole!
I guarantee you, it'll be a blast.
So flashback to 2007 and Infinity Ward are about to redefine the first-person shooter genre with modern warfare. At this point, World War II shooters had become pretty stagnated and they didn't really elicit that much interest from gamers anymore. But that didn't stop EA from releasing Medal of Honor Airborne. Yes, it was another World War II shooter, but this one was different. Because instead of just running around shooting German soldiers and blowing things up, you still did that, but now you got to jump out of a plane beforehand. You see, in Medal of Honor Airborne, you're playing as Private Boyd Travers, a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. Despite being a pretty minor addition to the formula, I do have to admit that the whole notion of jumping out of a plane is just pretty damn cool. And there's still something so awesome about jumping out of one of these at the beginning of a mission and being able to survey the battlefield below. It surprisingly never stops being thrilling. These missions are based off actual operations that took place during the war, like Operation Husky and Operation Market Garden. Like these were real battles where real people lost their lives. The concept is that instead of just being forced to do objectives in a specific order, you're more or less dropping into an actual combat zone, and then you can choose to go wherever you want to in whichever way. Now this is the idea, but I mean dropping in areas you're not supposed to usually gets you killed pretty quickly. Instead of regenerating health, which was starting to become the norm at the time, Airborne's got a health system where you've got 4 bars. And if you take enough damage to deplete a full bar, you'll need to find a health kit to fill it back up again. Otherwise, the bar's just going to refill over time. And it does kind of prevent you from just running around like a complete dickhead. I mean, you can if you want to, but you're going to have a bad time. Getting to each objective specifically is pretty straightforward and linear, but there's usually multiple paths to take to get there, giving you a much higher amount of freedom, or at least the illusion of it. Often after you complete like 2 or 3 objectives though, you then usually have to go to the same spot each time for the finale of the mission. And they don't wait all that long to throw you out of a plane either. I think like 30 seconds after starting the game, you're in the tutorial mission and being pushed out of one. And with Michael Giacchino's soundtrack in the background, it made for some pretty intense and cinematic moments. I think that track Unblocking Utah, which plays during the tutorial, might be one of my favourite songs in the entire franchise. This is one of the earliest games to run on the Unreal 3 engine, and I think it still holds up pretty well. Unreal Engine games usually show their age with the texture quality, but Airborne still does a pretty bang-up job for the most part. I think some of the weapons have been really well modelled, and the detail for some of them is just really great, like seeing little chips and scratches on the sides of the MP40 as an example. Now speaking of weapons, Airborne introduced a pretty neat little weapon upgrade system as well. And the way this works is that after getting a certain amount of kills with a particular weapon, you can essentially level it up to 2 times a weapon, which adds a new attachment that often improves its attributes. Like it could be a better sight, it could be a foregrip or a bigger magazine, and it's kinda neat because it makes you want to experiment with different weapons to get all the upgrades. Just a bummer that half of the upgrades for the rifles consist of grenade launchers. I'd rather launch my farts. And there's a pretty good roster of expected guns from the World War II era, like the M1 Garand, the MP40, the Thompson SMG, and my personal favourite, the STG-44. It would have been nice to see more weapons in there, to be honest, but it seems they've gone with more of a tried and tested formula more than anything else. But at least it makes you want to switch up your playstyle and not stick to a familiar gun the entire campaign. I mean, you can rock an M1 Garand and the STG-44 the entire thing if you want to, but you're missing out on trying out all the other guns, and it's going to make things seem pretty damn repetitive. The problem is though that once you get these upgrades, as far as I know, you cannot remove them. Which isn't bad for things that objectively improve a weapon's reload times or accuracy, but some of the upgrades are going to add a scope. And if you don't really want to use a scope on that gun, well, too bad, you're stuck with it. Scopes are a bit of a pain in the ass because of the game's depth of field effect, which just never works the way you want it to. And usually looking down a scope just makes everything look completely blurry. I only found out after I captured all my footage that you can actually turn this crap off, along with the horrid motion blur and the bloom effects, which kinda look like smeared ass. There's some dumb shit too, like how you can load a stripper clip into the Springfield rifle when it's got a scope on it. Which, I mean, I don't think that is physically possible because the scope would be blocking the chamber, right? Look at me, complaining about weapon reload animations like a complete douchebag. When you look underneath all of this stuff though, the parachuting, the weapon upgrades, the nightmare fuel physics, it was still just your generic World War II shooter. And I gotta say that airborne shooting controls are just really kinda crappy. I think the best way to describe it is floaty, if that makes sense. There's some kind of weird mouse acceleration going on, because aiming precisely can just be really tricky, even with the sensitivity turned down really low. Now I've turned off the acceleration in the config file, but it doesn't really fix it. And as a result, something as simple as aiming and firing at someone's head seems to be much more challenging than it really should be. It ain't all that good with a mouse and keyboard, and it's just a clusterfuck with a controller. When you're aiming down sights, if you press strafe left or right, you're gonna lean in that direction, which I actually really like, and I think it's kinda seamless and fluid. The downside though is that it locks you in place when you're doing this, but it works really well when you do it from behind cover. But even doing this, you're still gonna notice how often your guns just can't seem to hit jack shit. The main reason I think for this is the random spread when firing weapons, and that's something which isn't really explained or communicated visually, through the use of like the crosshair expanding or anything. Now, as I understand it, weapons work best when fired in short bursts, especially with automatic weapons like the Thompson and the MP40. And holding down the fire button from long distances is just really inaccurate. But even then, there's just some weird shit going on with the way that the shooting works, where you'll be certain you should have hit someone, but for some reason it just looks like the bullets completely missed them, or it doesn't even register in the first place. It's like this weird pseudo-realistic ballistic system that's just so inconsistent, and it just never makes all that much sense. As a result, most guns work best at medium to close range. And maybe all of this was done intentionally to kinda force you into getting head on with the enemy. I mean, if you could just hang back and pop guys in the head from a distance, there'd be no real challenge or threat to the combat. And the fact that you almost have to get right up in their faces because of how shoddy the hit detection is does kind of heighten the intensity of the gunfights. I'm not sure I'd say if the enemy AI is like super intelligent, but they're certainly mobile, which definitely makes them harder to hit. They'll throw the odd grenade and they'll retreat if you try to push them, but otherwise they're pretty standard. And they'll just hide behind cover for the most part and hit you with half decent accuracy. That is, until you get near them in close range, at which point they turn into fucking lunatics. I don't think I've ever played another shooting game where enemies become so aggressive with melee attacks. It's kind of funny how they go from being so defensive in range combat to just charging right up to you, going Super Saiyan and beating the piss out of you. Airborne also has this odd kind of ranking system for enemies, where they start out at level 1 and go right up to level 10. And I don't really know what distinguishes these enemies. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's based off the guns they use and their accuracy, but they don't seem to be vastly any more or less intelligent. And this kind of highlights a bit of an odd turn in the series, which has usually strived for a somewhat realistic portrayal of soldiers. Because from like rank 1 to 8, you're just up against mostly normal looking enemies. But then when you get to rank 9 and 10, it feels like something out of a Wolfenstein game. The rank 9 enemies are these guys wearing gas masks that fire Panzerschrecks with infinite ammo. And then the rank 10 enemies are the Nazi Storm Elite, which are guys again in gas masks that walk around hip-firing MG42s. You come up against these guys in the last couple of missions and encounter them a fair bit in the final mission. Both of these enemy types are very similar to the Venom Troopers in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and it all kind of culminates for the game's final mission, which takes place in what I can only describe as a giant Nazi death tower, and it just kind of feels out of place for a Medal of Honor game. Be prepared to fight all of these enemies pretty much by yourself, because the other soldiers that fight alongside you are basically window dressing, and about as useful as a condom in the Vatican. I don't know why developers always thought it was a good idea to make your teammates completely useless in a lot of these old World War II games, but all it really does is just ruin the immersion. I mean, if the other Allied soldiers fought really well, it would make the game more realistic and believable. You'd really feel like another soldier just caught up in this huge confrontation. But instead, being a one-man army and having to single-handedly win every gunfight just makes it all seem like some kind of dumb action movie. Then again, we're talking about a game that has armoured, gas mask-wearing enemies that walk around hip-firing an MG42. It wouldn't be a Medal of Honor game without those dogshit checkpoints, and don't worry, Airborne has its fair share of dogshit checkpoints. For some reason though, whenever you're killed, instead of reloading a checkpoint, the game instead loads you back into the plane you dropped from, and you have to parachute back in again from scratch. What's kinda weird too is that often all the enemies you've killed will have respawned, so you need to go back to the same areas and spend another 5 minutes killing them all over again. Maybe they just wanted to really reinforce this whole parachuting mechanic, but just becomes really frustrating and kinda time consuming. It's even more annoying because weapon upgrades don't stay unless you hit a checkpoint, so you could kill 100 enemies and upgrade a couple of guns along the way, but then it all gets lost when you get killed and have to restart. Sucks. Checkpoints are tied to completing mission objectives, which can often take upwards of 10 or so minutes to complete. So if you die right as you're about to complete one, well, get ready to replay the last 10 or so minutes again, bitch. All up, there's 6 missions in total, not counting the tutorial, and most of these take around 30 minutes or so to finish, so sadly it's really not going to take all that long to get through it. A completely dead multiplayer mode isn't going to leave you much to do either, unless you just want to go back through the single player and acquire all the weapon upgrades. I think they kind of missed out on the potential to tell a decent story here, because each mission just kind of starts and ends without all that much in between, aside from a briefing screen where you stare at the back of someone else's head. There's short little intermissions where you can hear the soldiers bantering during a flight, and at the beginning of each mission before you jump out of the plane, the other guys are often going to chat to each other and joke around. But it's just never explored any more than that. I mean, I don't even know who these guys are that I'm jumping with. They all pretty much look the same and their whereabouts after each mission is just never explained. As a result, it just ends up feeling kinda lifeless and lacking any emotion or connection for the player. Maybe they did this so it didn't look like they were copying Brothers in Arms or something, but the game just lacks any kind of soul as a result. Now I'm going to say something here that might offend a lot of people, but most of the Medal of Honor games just aren't really all that good. They've always just been little more than World War II themed interactive shooting galleries. I mean, name the playable character in Rising Sun, Pacific Assault, or even European Assault. Allied Assault on PC and Frontline on the PS2 were pretty good, and there was a definite connection that players had with Jimmy Patterson as the protagonist. But most of the others really haven't stood the test of time all that well if you really break it all down. And to be honest, neither has Medal of Honor Airborne. 2007 also marks that time period where we had something of a revival for the shooting genre. I mean, from this point on we had games like Modern Warfare, Crysis, Bioshock and Stalker, and we're on the cusp of just getting some really solid games. Despite all the issues Airborne has though, it's still surprisingly one of my favourite games in the series after Allied Assault, and I think I've easily finished it a dozen times if not more. I still enjoy unlocking the weapon upgrades, I like the soundtrack, and I still have fun with some of the missions. But I feel like every time I keep replaying it, I just find something new that somehow annoys me. And I don't think it's going to be all that much of a great experience for someone playing it for the first time in 2019. Still though, there's definitely worse World War II shooters out there, and it's also interesting seeing a game that EA worked on before they became the gaming industry's equivalent of Lex Luthor.